In this episode of The Fifth Domain, I'm joined by seasoned cyber leader Nathan Clarke, whose career spans military, government, finance, aviation, and energy sectors. From high-pressure environments to highly regulated industries, Nathan has built and led security teams on the front lines of risk. In this conversation, he unpacks what really makes a SOC successful, not just in terms of tech, in terms of team dynamics, leadership, and measurable outcomes. Nathan, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thanks, Matt.
Great. So starting off, Nathan, you've got a lot of experience in cyber operations and military and etc. like this. Why don't you just give us a bit of a background of where you started and your journey through cyber operations?
Yeah, sure. So I was in the military, as you mentioned. Most of that was focused on signals, so information technology, tactical level signals. Did a bunch of stuff. Towards the end of my career, I actually got a role in the ADF cert, and that was where I first worked full time. And it was ultimately where I decided that when I got out of the military, that's what I'll be doing in my civilian career. So, so since then, jumped out of the military and then did all those things that you mentioned, worked in SOCs in telco and airlines, banks, energy, government. So I've done a whole bunch of stuff there since then.
Yeah, great. And so you coming out of military and going into standing up a SOC, how did you approach that? What lessons learned? Because back when you started building SOCs, there was no blueprint for building a SOC. There was no best practices, etc. like this. There were not a lot of mentors you could go to. So where did you start? Like what lessons and knowledge did you take and learn and then apply that to building a SOC?
Yeah, you're right. There wasn't a lot there then. And what was around was very technically focused. So very tactical level analytics, pretty much nothing in the way of actually, what are those best practices around establishing a SOC. But I took a few lessons from that first experience in ADF Cert and listened to some of the more experienced members there. It's not all built on that experience. Certainly conducting and running an operation, such as what works in a SOC, is also informed by my experience as a staff officer. So, that art of operational management that you pick up as a junior officer in the Army has also played a big part. Really, it's about environment as well. Not all SOCs are conducive to being established the way that you feel is probably the best way. But I was very lucky and I got to go into some environments like Telstra. I think that was my first gig after I left, and ultimately that was a great environment for me to just lay out a SOC the way that I saw fit, and a lot of the knowledge that I gained there, we built together as a team. So it was basically sitting in a room. Okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Let's work out a process that's repeatable and scalable. And eventually we started to formulate some of the stuff that I still do today around detection lifecycle management, which I'm sure we'll get into. And then, some of the processes and the means and ways of doing that in order to set up an operation that is effective and will scale.
And so when you did that and when you started out and you had ideas about what you needed and what a SOC should look like and what could look like, etc., as you went through that initial journey, what changed? What ideas sort of were, that's not going to work. We need to do something else. How was your thinking at the end of the establishment different to the start?
Well, I've repeated that cycle a few times, and each time I find a way to make it a little bit better. Diminishing returns over time because some SOCs still have the same issues. But the main thing that changed over the course of establishing a few SOCs was, the critical role of detection engineering. In most places, I think there is still engineering, but it doesn't distinguish between maintaining the platforms versus just focusing on the detection. And I think that that's a very important distinction. And in other parts of the world, that distinction is much clearer today than it was 5 years ago. And so what is emerging and what I certainly advocate when I go work with a SOC is that detection engineering is distinct from the engineering that you apply to sustaining the availability of the platforms that you use. Because that's a full-time job. I mean, sustaining a CM stack on-prem takes a lot of effort. A little less effort if you've got a cloud-based or a SaaS type deployment, but still a significant amount of effort. And I see a lot of value in keeping detection engineering separate from the systems engineering. And that detection engineering works to the SOC manager, whereas a system engineering doesn't necessarily need to because their focus is availability. But that detection engineering is just everything to me now. It's the critical input to the operation that the SOC manager is responsible ultimately for conducting.
And so for some people who are new to this realm, there's listeners who don't work in SOCs, etc. Just to unpack what is detection engineering, what's involved with it, and why is it so important within security operations?
It's, as I said, there's detection engineering, so people who are focused on producing alerting that then analysts will handle. So that's probably the people side of it. The process side of it is a detection lifecycle management process. And that was, for me, that was built because I've moved from SOC to SOC to SOC, and the technology tends to change every time I go to a new SOC. I needed a process that is largely agnostic of the technology. The other, I guess, somewhat philosophical view that I have is that I don't put all my faith in the technology to do the detection out of the box. That I learned that very quickly in my first SOC, that getting the detection you want is not going to come from the vendor. They'll provide out of the box rules, but they're going to need to be tuned anyway to suit the conditions and the behaviours that exist in your environment, which are going to be completely unique. And so that's as I said, that's the philosophical thinking or the mindset that I have with it. It can't be turn on the box, get your detection, and your analysts will take care of the problem. It just never is that simple. And, I have to push back against software vendors who constantly sell that message. Buy our CM and you will get better detection. I have never seen that to be true. It places faith in the wrong thing. And my faith is in people and a good process that makes sure that analysts are presented with good, relevant alerting that they can then handle through to determination and then, ultimately enable that response where necessary.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of really good points there about alerts and et cetera, and technologies not being, a one size fits all. Also about analysts having that mindset to then run things down to, a determination of, truth positive, false positive, et cetera, like this. Talk to me about what is the, a process around, taking a, out of the box alert or something. It might be a media attack pseudocode linking to a particular, module. Or what is the good practice process to go from, zero to hero? And I imagine it's a continuous cycle, right? Because everything's changing and threats and your IT environment, et cetera. What does that look like to basically increase the quality of that detection engineering?
Yeah, well, it starts on managing that life cycle correctly. And it also has to be understood that an alert is not the start of the work in managing the operation. And handling the alert and having a determination, the end state needs to be understood from the various perspectives within the SOC. If you're a detection engineer, your end state is somewhat the alert working and presenting well. But the end state for the whole operation is that the response is made, particularly for those things that are obviously deemed as true positives. But the start point and end point in the detection or in a detection lifecycle is a scenario upon which you then design your alerts. So in a lot of SOCs, the focus is on the alert. My approach is to have a scenario. So a well-written scenario upon which an alert can be designed, but the end state needs to include the determination, not just the alert. that alert bias creates problems around not enough data being in the SIEM to complete the investigation. So in the detection lifecycle that I teach to SOCs, there's a scenario and there's a determination. Alert is one part of it and the investigation is the other part of it. And then together you should get clear determinations. And the determinations are something I tend to have to reset when I go into SOCs as well. A lot of places still have a problem, what I tend to call binary classification syndrome, where it's either a true positive, and if it's not a true positive, everything else is a false positive. And that creates a lot of problems in measuring actual outcomes and capturing problems such as duplicates and insufficient information determinations are quite important to be able to identify. And testing and faults in alerting need to be tracked as well. So there's actually 6 determinations that should be used. And when you take that approach of scenario through to determination, alerting is one of the goals, presentation of that alert is another goal, but the investigation that requires evidence that is not contained in the alert needs to be considered as well so that we have good determinations. And true and false positive, and this may sound controversial, but true and false positive are risk mitigative outcomes. Now, true positive, that's easy to understand. Okay, we've identified something that's bad and we're going to go do a response. Why is false positive risk mitigative response? It is because the evidence that you have collected has determined that the bad scenario that we're investigating has not played out. And we have evidence that proves that that scenario did not play out. And so in my mind, false positives can be a risk mitigative outcome. Insufficient information as a determination is where the evidence doesn't rise enough it doesn't rise past the threshold to be able to determine a true or false positive. That's bad. That's a determination that needs some operational level analysis to understand why the analyst wasn't able to establish enough evidence for a true or false positive. And so it sounds complicated, but you've got to set these markers clearly so that the detection life cycle works, as in the input to the operation, and that the metrics that you measure on those determinations, which is your output, can be measured correctly, and you can use that to do continual improvement. So.
Yeah, I really like that concept, Nath, of, there's 6 determinations and, one of them is a true positive, and then, and basically, a false positive well has, I imagine, a whole bunch of, 5 different things. It's almost, and then when you said, we know that we have evidence that it is a false positive, in a way, what you're turning that into is a true negative, aren't you? Because, you're basically going, it's almost like you're trying to get to the point where you are absolutely certain about what the alert was or the condition was, things like this, where, as you said, you're getting to that point of determination around an absolute, determination around an event or an activity, and so forth. And so a lot of what, we talk about, at Fifth Domain is also around getting to the point where there's a lot of ambiguity within cyber industry. There's a lot of, it's not a true positive, but we don't know what shades of grey of negative it was, and in a way that's almost becoming or breeding some complacency within industry where it's like, okay, we're only focused on the true positives, but if it's a false positive, then we'll just let it go. And I think what you're saying is that that's actually a rich opportunity to then explore and understand, the nature of your network, the nature of the activity, your users' behaviors, legitimate behaviors, your technologies, and so forth like this. So I really like the fact that, hey, those false positives are actually an opportunity for continuous improvement within the Security Operations Centre.
Yeah, if you're unpacking that binary classification syndrome and once you do unpack it and your SOC are now doing determinations correctly, then what you get is a logically correct false positive, as in evidence supporting that scenario did not play out, like the negative scenario that we're trying to identify that did not play out. But then if you have these other determinations, upon those you you can then focus your efforts around specific detections that might be problematic. And so mathematically on the detection, on the outcomes, you can establish things like precision rates. So that's like true positive over true positive plus false positive plus insufficient information to get a bit of a gross percentage of how effective how many true positives come out of that handled work. Duplicates, faults and tests are unhandled work, and they require their own analysis, and you can apply some sort of ratio percentage to each of those. And on a gross scale, great for reporting, tells something of a story to senior leadership, but a SOC manager should actually be establishing those metrics on a per detection basis. So if you have a detection, say malware, and you have true positives, false positives, and other determinations, you can go and do some analysis on those determinations to figure out where things may need to improve. It might surprise you to know that in most places I go, if you have a malware detection, it's not 100% true positives. It's high. It's usually up above 50%. But yeah, some things will trigger endpoint detection and response that is not malware. And sometimes you have your admins dropping the ICAR test file. Well, that's a test determination. So those not all detections will be close to the 100%. Some will be actually very low, and that would be totally okay for that scenario. So precision is not a target, it's an indicator. If you have something that is highly volumetric but low in precision, that's probably worth going and have a look to see if we can improve that detection. And that's the other mindset that I tend to challenge when I walk into a SOC. We have false positives. False positives are our problem. They are not actually the problem. If you have good detection, if your effort is focused on improving detection, the secondary effect will be a reduction in false positives. But if a SOC is focused on false positives as a problem, that tends to breed a lot of bad practices, such as whitelisting hosts in a huge exception list or users, and what they end up doing is putting blinders on detection and reducing the effectiveness of a detection with those bad practices, because it comes from a mindset of false positives are our problem. They aren't a problem. Not if they're being analysed and they're evidence supported and all that stuff is correct. So my focus is always on improving detection and then just sort of tracking the metrics on the determinations to see where we may have issues or opportunities to improve those detections.
You touched on some or described some very interesting metrics there, that are probably beyond what most people or SOC managers think about. Mean time to detection, mean time to response. These very coarse metrics, and I often think that within security operations and security in general, because a lot of security's job is really to maintain a negative. Their job is to stop something from happening, etc. So often the metrics that are being used within security operations are based on available data rather than actually driving performance or business outcomes for the organisation. So they're counting what they can see rather than counting what matters. So in your experience, Nathan, what are the top 3 or 2 or 3 metrics that you use within SOCs when you walk in there, and how will those metrics drive? What are they driving? Like, what's the quality or performance that they're trying to drive?
Yeah, so there's metrics that I use to identify issues at a tactical level. So those would be the metrics focused around specific detections, detection use cases. So if I have a detection scenario, it has 1, 2, or 5 rules, and I'm looking at the precision rate of that. There's also the quality assurance process. So that adds a degree of clarity or qualification to some inferences that can be made just looking at the numbers. At a tactical level, I'm looking at things like precision rate. What's the precision rate of a particular scenario? Some of the takeaways from those metrics might be that we should have a higher precision rate for this. It's built on pretty high fidelity log source that has a lot of information. We should be getting we should have a higher precision rate for that particular scenario. That's an example of a tactical level metric that can be used as a part of that detection lifecycle management. So there's tactical, then there's the operational. So this is again a mindset. There's operational level metrics, and then there's the tactical level things. Tactical is very much net measurements. Operational more towards the gross measurements. But one of the metrics that I like to track in a SOC that's very easy to communicate to senior leadership is, on the whole, how much time are we actually spending on queue? And there's a variety of different ways that I've calculated that. I've used rosters. I've captured time from the handling system, if it's ServiceNow or a SOAR or something, capturing those net times and totaling them all together. Quite often times I'll use a staff calculator. So, staff, I've got 10 analysts and they all work 8 hours a day. I take 10 or 20% off that for the other things that they do that is not monitoring a queue, and then I'll tally that together, divide that by the amount of handled work, true, false, insufficient information, and from that I'll get what's called a gross handling time. Now, gross handling time is important to me because that helps me understand how busy my analysts are, and I mean, of course, I'll go ask them. But I like to try to work that out, then ask them to validate it, and I'll use that particular metric to decide whether I want to deploy more detection. And what I tend to do is I set a threshold, and that will be informed by how well trained the staff are or what their general skill level is. In some circumstances, I'll say 60 minutes is a recommended gross handling time. Or for an internal team that's well-funded, low turnover, good retention of skill and knowledge, really good at documenting things and communicating amongst themselves, I'll say 20 or 30 minutes. And then I'll track that gross handling time over weeks or months and then use that to decide if I want to deploy more detection. Now, that's where that's not really... Is it SOC Manager stuff? I mean, it's highly iterative stuff, but I mean, it's also kind of base level leadership. How much work is presenting to my team? How much of my team's effort goes onto that? And do I have enough effort to handle that much work? I kind of don't really see that as SOC Manager stuff. But it does help inform decisions about deploying more detection. And so time is sort of everything to a SOC Manager, or at least I believe time is the critical resource. So monitoring time, gross handling time, those are decisions that will help inform if I want to deploy more detection. And if I feel like the team is busy enough, I might hold off on deploying more detection, and I'll communicate that clearly with the business. But then I will look at ways of making the work that we've currently got more efficient. If I can take 10 use cases and I can reduce their handling time by 20%, that means I can deploy more detection and I'm not burning out my team. And that's really important. You have to, we'll probably get into leadership, but you have to preserve your team, preserve their morale, preserve their effort, and keep them engaged. John Hubbard calls it virtuous cycles. And he did a great presentation a number of years ago about that. But you have to preserve your workforce and not burn them out. And I use those gross handling metrics to inform how I manage their workload and what I need to achieve for the business. If I can reduce their handling time by implementing a SOAR, doing some more automation, more training to help them hasten their investigations, that's going to reduce the amount of handling time, and that's going to put more time in my back pocket upon which I want to deploy more detection. And then I'm going to go and tell the business that story. Okay, we've expanded our detection capability. We are mitigating more risk today than what we were 12 months ago. And I want to be able to tell that story. There's a limit to all of that. You can be really efficient. You can have a lot of detection deployed, and you capture all of that data. And then when the business says, hey, I want more detection, well, I give the business a choice. Okay, so we're sort of maxed out on efficiency. I can turn off some lower priority detections to deploy this detection that is not yet deployed, or you can give me more FTE and here's the data. So that's the conversation.
Excellent. And I like how you focus in on time is, a critical denominator within security metrics. It's an important resource. Why do you think time is so crucial as a resource within security operations, which is maybe different to, normal, conventional, business operations, et cetera? A lot of the things we talk about, time to, response and et cetera like this. What is it about the nature of cyber operations where time is such a critical resource?
Yeah, I can draw a direct line between the time it takes to handle the work we do and the risk mitigative effect of that work. As I said, we can handle the gross metrics. They don't tell a per detection story. They really are a gross division of effort and work, and that's just the idea of that is just to make sure that at a team level. And again, this is easy conversations with a CISO or a CIO. That on a gross scale, it's generally easy to understand. I have this much work. Like if I was to extract what my detection scenarios are currently focused on, I could link that to the overall risk management framework and say that this much time is mitigating this much risk in our risk management framework. So just making that connection is really important, because I see a lot of SOCs really struggle to have that conversation with the business. What are we actually doing? I see a lot of B and C level reporting that when you take a step back from what they're reporting at the B and C level, all it's really saying is, we're working. Mm-hmm. We're all working. But how much of our capacity is offsetting an amount of risk? Okay, and that's, again, the detection lifecycle can help you connect those things, and then your effort tracking can help tell the story of how much of your effort is applied against what detections and what detections are mitigating what risks, and then you have a much easier time asking for things like more FTE. And that's like I said, time is everything. So it's
exactly.
It's the key resource.
And you touch on a point there when people ask, what is the SOC actually doing? And so I've had experiences where walking into organizations and they want to do what I call the community policing, which is the, spear phishing emails or resetting passwords or, failed login attempts, and having that touch point back with the business, because then it's, they get a connection to the rest of the business, it's visible and etc. But often sometimes, when you think about, okay, we're going to purely focus on, or not purely, but predominantly focus on, the critical assets, the vaults, right? But it's going to require people, in a way, just sort of standing there, not doing anything, or in a way, because they're guarding it. That's what they're focusing, and they're waiting for, something to happen. They're protecting and they're patrolling and so forth. So patrolling and guarding is often, not visible. It looks like it's doing nothing, but it's actually, that's the point, is that you're ready and able to respond quickly when something does happen, and you're not tied up on another activity in a way. So it's a real challenge, I think, for security leaders, especially in operations, to be able to go, no, the team isn't not doing anything. They're just on standby. They're ready to respond. They might be sitting down like firemen. They could be just in a station, but they're actually waiting, and they're not doing anything, because when something does happen, they need to be ready to respond straight away and to go. And so I think that's some of the challenge with security in general, is that if some organizations, they don't really understand what is the linkage between business risk and a cyber threat and an attack, and therefore understanding what do we need to do to prevent that thing happening. So I think it's, you touch on a point, what are the SOC doing? I think a lot of the metrics that you're providing is really important, because they are going to be linking back into that business outcome. And I think that's some of the, lacking within the industry at the moment. So I just want to change tack a little bit now, Nathan, to talk about the people aspects of it. So you've worked in the military, the army. It's a very people culture strong organisation, operating environment. In the SOC environment, and you talked about people coming up with and following tickets or incidents or alerts down to a deterministic outcome. How do you get someone to do that? How do you nurture that? How do you create that organizational change to be able to then go, okay, it's not about, false positive, close, off we go, next ticket, etc. like this. How do you do that? How do you breed that? How do you find the right people? How do you motivate people to behave in that way?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and you contend with issues such as culture and what maybe came before you. When you're stepping into a SOC that's already been established, you have to dismantle things like learned helplessness. Sometimes you really have to pull off some workforce structural changes in order to facilitate how you want to manage people in a better way. A lot of SOCs who historically have they haven't had, like the analysts haven't had access to detection engineering, or the engineering team who's managing the SIEM is far and away in some distant thing on the other end of a JIRA portal. That creates a mindset of non-ownership. And I really work to try to dismantle that where I can. I don't like to see teams of analysts and SOC staff feel like they're a slave to the technology. That the tech is there, it's the thing that the CIO or CISO cares about the most, because it's probably more expensive than a single person. I don't want people to feel like they're a slave to that thing. And AI is the same, and you might have a question about AI, but again, what I tend to leverage as a part of the detection lifecycle management process is to really get people involved in working to improve the detection. That has so many benefits. One, it gets people off the queue, so they're not sitting there doing log and flog, all day long. They get to step aside, go into a room around a whiteboard, and really ham out a good detection. What do we need to do to tune this detection scenario? Really get them off the queue and thinking about that. And that has many benefits, because all of a sudden they're being presented work that they know they've had a hand in improving. And so immediately they feel like they own that, and that they're owning the improvement. You repeat that cycle across all of your detections. You get that life cycle working really well. You get everybody within the team involved. And that's kind of like step one for me. Getting people involved and feeling like that they own what's happening, or like owning that improvement, makes them feel like they own more of the success of the team, and that's really important. I hate to see analysts sort of sitting in the corner, just flog, and they step out at the end of the day and I've just drawn a check. It's really about getting ownership, and again, that's step one. The organisational change, then I try to get to flourish from there. So we're having regular detection meetings. We're talking about issues with detection. We're all owning it. We all feel like we're successful. And at that point, I sort of, phase two. And what I want there is I want then people to then step outside the SOC, go out and talk with people. Classic example for me is network teams. Network teams are kind of like SOC teams. They're knock and sock, the knockers sitting down the basement, surrounded by, flashing lights. They know a lot about an enterprise, and where your classical cloud teams and Active Directory teams, they all have this very siloed view about their particular part of the forest or their directory or their cloud instance or whatever. Network teams these days, with enterprises being so diverse in the setup of their cloud and Active Directory infrastructure, network teams have maintained since the beginning a different view of the environment. And that's my first target in terms of getting a relationship going up and outside of the SOC, is getting those NOC people involved and getting their perspective on what's happening on the environment. And so have detection development meetings with the NOC, have detection development meetings with the identity and access management people who create users, so you can understand how users are created. Every enterprise creates users a little bit differently, and there's always nuance. Lots and lots of Microsoft stacks out there, but I've found that every enterprise has a differently nuanced way of creating user accounts, both standard and privileged. And the people that I work with know what my T-shirt saying is, nuance is the power. When it comes to detection, you can seize on that nuance. A privileged accounts will only ever be created between 8 and 4, and they'll only ever be created between Monday to Friday. So have alerting that, fires outside of those hours and those days when a privileged account is created. You'll be able to find a lot of things. If you read historically some of the big compromises, you'll probably get an alert, out of each of those stories. So seizing the nuance and getting out and talking with other teams is absolutely critical for a SOC. It helps improve the detection work that the SOC is working on. It helps gain ownership, and then you can spread that joy to the rest of the organisation. And you'd be surprised, SOC sitting in the corner, working on its own, hated by the rest of IT because they just sit in the corner saying no, 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 no. But if you can flip that and you can get out and talk with other teams, a recent example, I held a very large detection meeting, and I invited all the verticals to be involved, and I called it Detectonomicon. So give it a flashy name, something that will intrigue people. And I had everybody there. I had, network team and identity team and the threat intel people, and it's just a really great, rich breeding ground of good detections, because the SOC knows the business, but IT knows the business, and IT, if you involve them in detection work, they start to feel like they're contributing to something really special. And a SOC is a special place. I'm biased, of course, but get them involved in what the SOC is doing, and that it helps pave relationships for when things get really bad. If there's a big compromise, you want to be able to lean on the relationship that you've built around doing the detection work, and then everybody understands how the SOC works. If you're having these meetings and you're talking to the rest of IT about how you manage detection, they'll start bringing ideas to you. And that's kind of the goal. That's how you start to make that organisational level cultural shift of getting IT to support the SOC and having SOC step out and support IT where they can. So,
yeah, I love that, Nathan. Nuance is the key. And so from my perspective, what you're doing is bringing the analysts into the detection so they understand the bigger picture. You're bringing the SOC team or the network team into the SOC as well so that they understand the bigger picture. So essentially it's all about context and being able to align, someone's particular little activity to the bigger picture and see that you're all on the same team and that what you do affects these people over here and et cetera like that. And that's important, not just for engineering the system, but also operating it. Like you said, when, if there's an incident and you need to be able to collaborate, people are already warmed up. They're already, ready to go. They understand why you're asking it or what could happen, et cetera. So, and that, I love that the nuance is generated through, that particular collaboration. Sort of leads into my next question around military and cyber. And so obviously you have the background as well. What lessons from the military are applicable to cyber operations in the civilian world, in the industry, and so forth? And you talked a little bit about, in a way, almost like joint exercises, right, between the NOC and the SOC and et cetera. I mean, that could be considered, similar in the military context as well. But from your experiences, what do you think is most relevant and important within cyber operations that could come through from the military?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, one of my last experiences in the military was as a staff officer, and in that role, I got to it really opened my eyes. Like, operations at that scale can be highly complex, and my experience in planning some of those things really, even to this day, informs how I think about conducting operations. And probably the key principle would be that in a lot of SOCs, in sort of the private and public civilian sectors, there is a propensity to have these homogenous teams of SOC manager and just analysts. And they'll lump the entire operation onto that SOC manager's back and say, you're responsible for monitoring and detection across this entire enterprise, but all he or she has is, a handful of analysts. No span of responsibility for engineering or detection engineering. And so the responsibility is mismatched by the resources that are provided, to, that SOC manager. Now, in a military context, that would be like, giving a joint task force commander just infantry only and expecting them to be able to go and sustain operations for 2 months. No logistical support, no field engineers, none of that other stuff that makes military operations function, which is quite diverse in terms of capability and resources. Strangely, some SOC managers, you are detection and response, but you're only going to get 5 analysts. It confuses me. And so I tend to advocate that if you are going to give the responsibility to a security operations manager, he or she needs to be furnished with all of the resources required to manage and sustain that operation end to end. That is, he or she needs to have more than just analysts, and needs to be able to diversify their workforce to include detection engineering, analytics, and in certain contexts, cyber threat intelligence. So that's sort of the 3 pillars that I advocate that have to sit under a SOC manager. That homogenous approach is usually born out of a lot of hierarchical levels in an organisation. I've found that that's common in government. In private sector, they can't afford to have all of that level of management, so you'll tend to have a SOC manager, CISO, and CIO. But there still is that requirement that if you make the responsibility of the SOC manager the monitoring and detection for that entire enterprise, they need to be furnished with those 3 pillars: detection engineering, analytics, and cyber threat intelligence. The analytics component of that should be divided horizontally from junior to senior, where your seniors are running the QA process and supporting the juniors. They're doing threat hunting, so non-alert driven analysis, and then working to ensure that everything is stitched together on the detection lifecycle management. And so there's some a little bit of operational complexity in those 3 pillars, but when the balance is struck, you tend to have a good operation. And that concept within military speak is synchronization and synthesis. So achieving those operational aims from my military experience has informed how I want my SOCs to be structured. But if you're listening and you're a SOC manager, get detection engineering in your teams, okay, and have a detection lifecycle. That's a little free advice.
That's a great message. Thanks, Nathan. So we're out of time, but just to summarize, Nathan, it's been great having you on the show. You've got a lot of experience and a collage of experience that you've brought into security operations, focusing on detection engineering, looking at it's not just a binary outcome of true positives and false positives, etc. Actually looking at those false positives as a rich opportunity to explore learning opportunities and continuous improvement, around looking at focusing on metrics to drive performance around the team and linking that into business operations. And especially I love your idea around the nuance and the team and collaborating on not just the actual operations, but in the design process as well, which is really coming to your last point around, your military and your capability. A capability is more than just, an infantry force, like you said, or an analyst force. It is something that needs to sustain and enable those people in conducting those operations as well. So really great conversation. Thanks, Nathan. Just for everyone there, if people want to reach out, how can they contact you? How can they follow up questions or learn more, with you? You have a, LinkedIn, etc.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me. I think it's just /NA Clarke. Or reach me via Bluerydge. That's generally how I can be reached, just to talk about these sorts of things.
Great. Thanks very much, Nathan. It's been a great conversation, really rich, and looking forward to how you take on the rest of the SOCs within Australia and help them, grip up their performance in order to sort of fight the war and defend Australia. So thank you very much for your time.
No worries. Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate it.